What up, TCK Potters? Sky back with you for another episode of the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast, episode 277. We are bringing in our Wednesday guest every single week. That's Bobby Lamarco, a.k.a. Fantasy Football X Factor. Bobby, how you feeling, buddy?
Sky, I'm ready to talk week 5, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you. It's been a nice week so far. Dewey's had a great Stat Rat episode yesterday. We did a nice Ballers and Stallers before that. Tomorrow, of course, we're bringing Dewey's back for the later games, and then Friday we do our TCK breakdown. So it's good, man. It's week 5. We got a nice flow here on the podcast. Everybody knows their roles. Everybody's doing their thing, and it feels good. It feels comfortable. Feels fluid. Hey, before we get too far into this, man, I know that you're a West Coast guy like myself. You're a Southern California guy, so San Diego guy. I've noticed the Padres hat in previous recordings. Big game tonight as we're recording. Big series against the northern rivals there, the Dodgers. Not a podcast about baseball, but I am a baseball nerd at heart. I have to throw it out to you really quick. I'm rooting for you guys because I was born a Giants fan. I have to root against the Dodgers. That's just the code of what we do. But I got to ask you, do you think you have an honest chance to take them down?
Yeah. Come on now. Gotta stay positive. They're the last San Diego team. If we turn our backs on them, then what do we have? So I'm sticking with them.
Love it. So unfortunately, the San Diego Superchargers are no more, but you'll stick with the Padres. I dig it. I wish you the best, my man. All right, well, let's dive right into it, yo. We've been doing this for a handful of weeks now. We've got a month under our belt. The first quarter of the season is behind us. We know the drill here. We're going to knock out these 9 games in the early slot on Sunday. Before we get into it, Bobby,
this guy cut out of there.
the first quarter of the season.
Sorry, man. You cut out for a second. I didn't hear you. What did you ask for?
No worries. I was wondering if you could give us just kind of one thing that you've learned over the first quarter of the season here. We got 4 weeks under our belts, a lot of injuries, a lot of COVID situations. Obviously, the bye week's coming up with the Packers and the Lions this week. I'm wondering if there was one thing in particular that you've taken away from the first quarter of the season.
Game flow matters, man. I mean, the first thing I've realized is that a lot of these guys that I've talked about the last few weeks is looking at spreads and understanding, like, what these are big-time favorites. You can find a lot of value in guys. Like, I know a great example was last week, Terry McLaurin. You know, he had a very tough matchup. But when you're down so much and you're throwing a lot late in games and those teams are in prevent defense, you're going to rack up fantasy points. So I think it's very important that not to fade good players in bad matchups, especially if it's a big spread, if it's a big favorite. Now, in tougher matchups, in closer games like a 3-point spread, that's when you want to fade those guys because they're not going to get that prevent defense garbage time. But I've seen that a lot happening over and over again, and I think it's been fantastic for fantasy. So don't fade guys in tough matchups if they are underdogs big in those games. I
like that. That's a great call. And for me, it's just on the fantasy roster side, it's just, you know, you got to be flexible. I mean, I've got a number of leagues where I started off maybe the first 2 weeks scoring like 200 plus points in PPR. Those same exact teams now in week 3 and 4 have scored like 70, 95, you know what I mean? Like 130 if I'm lucky. It's just the injuries have been crazy. COVID's been nuts. We got the bye weeks coming up. You just have to be fluid, make a couple of trades. I had a big trade in the Dynasty League earlier this evening. Got a lot of things going on, so you got to stay fluid and you know, make those moves because, look, unless you're 0-4 looking to be 0-5, you can definitely turn this around. I have mentioned multiple times on the podcast, I was 0-4 the first year of the TCK Pod Listener League about 3 years ago. I was 0-4, made a couple of moves, made a couple waiver pickups and trades, and I actually ran the table 9-0. Got to the championship and took it down. So it is possible. You have to get lucky, of course, but you also got to make some moves. So Stay on it. All right, brother, let's jump into this. We know the drill here. Let's start with the morning games, the early afternoon games, I should say, for most of the country. Morning games for you and I at 10 a.m. We'll start with Carolina Panthers and the Atlanta Falcons. Divisional matchup. These are always fun. Carolina with the big win last week. And then Atlanta, man, looks absolutely in shambles. Their defense is horrendous, but with Julio Jones banged up, Calvin Ridley did not have a catch last week. we expected maybe in that scenario that at least Russell Gage would pop off. He did not. It was Zacchaeus, their 4-string receiver. Hayden Hurst barely got involved as well. Todd Gurley accidentally scored 2 touchdowns, but I don't think we can count on that. What is going on here with Matt Ryan and this defense in general? And do you trust Teddy B with 3 touchdowns here? And when are we going to see DJ Moore actually catch steam?
Yeah, I think so. In this matchup, too, it's actually a very close line, 2.5-point spread. So it's going to be interesting to see how this game flow actually pans out. But I think for the Carolina Panthers side, when you're looking at this team, first of all, the Falcons secondary at safety especially is decimated. So that communication on the back end, especially in a COVID off season, is going to be a problem. I think Teddy B is on the radar this week because of that matchup, because of those injuries to the secondary. Now, when you look at the running back position, Mike Davis has been a breath of fresh air. I was a big fan of Mike Davis in his days in Seattle, and he actually looked very good then, and he's kind of showing you why, because Teddy Bridgewater is not challenging defenses downfield. He's not throwing deep. He's not throwing deep accurately. He's checking down and throwing to the slot. And that's the biggest reason why Robbie Anderson is outperforming DJ Moore this season, because Robbie Anderson is actually playing a lot more in the slot than DJ Moore. And that's very important because we have seen in the past Teddy Bridgewater with Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara just be checking down and throwing to the middle of the field, rarely challenging defenses. That being said, when you look at who beats the Falcons, it's the best players. It's the guys that are the best players that day on the team. That's how bad it is. Like Robert Tonyan just going ham last on Monday night. I think this week could be DJ Moore's get-right game. I think Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore are both starts this week. And I think those guys are going to really perform well in this matchup because I do expect Matt Ryan, and you really do hope that Julio with the hamstring and Calvin Ridley with the ankle are both healthy enough to play in this game because you're going to want to see the Falcons score points. Now, if it's a sloppy game, kind of similar to what we saw with the LA Chargers when both the Panthers and the Chargers didn't score, it was like 21-16. That's not fantasy goodness. So I'm hoping that Julio's healthy and Calvin Ridley because then we're going to see points scored on each side. One name to monitor in this matchup, and I know this is crazy if you're a TJ Hawkinson owner and you're on a bye week and you're really desperate in a deeper league. Ian Thomas started building a little momentum. He started running a little more routes, and he also scored a touchdown. So, we just saw what Robert Tonyan did to this Falcons secondary, and I just talked about how the safeties are all banged up. So Ian Thomas could be on the fantasy radar this week because of that. Now, on the Falcons side, we're really just looking for injuries. I mean, Julio, Calvin, are they going to play? It's early. It's Tuesday when we're recording this. But if they play, they're in. I mean, Panthers aren't intimidating at all. We have seen Mike Evans and Keenan Allen both get over 100 yards. So the premier wide receivers can beat this secondary. There's no one that's really intimidating. So you're rolling with those guys if they are playing. Now, the question you just brought up is Todd Gurley. And Todd Gurley, listen, the Carolina Panthers, other than Kenyon Drake, everybody has done really well. We saw Leonard Fournette get over 100 yards. We saw Josh Jacobs blow up in week 1. So you got to like Todd Gurley in the run game, especially because of this matchup versus Carolina. As for the tight end position with Hayden Hurst, I'm actually a little concerned. We see the Carolina Panthers held down Hunter Henry and Darren Waller to 50 yards or fewer in both those games. So this could be a Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley week, and that's really it. Matt Ryan, to me, it's pending. It's 100% pending on Julio and Calvin Ridley's health in this one. If they are not playing, I'm not really that interested in playing Matt Ryan in this matchup. We haven't seen any quarterbacks specifically go off against the Carolina Panthers, and you can say whatever the reason is why, but we haven't seen that 300-yard multiple touchdown game in 4 weeks versus this Carolina team, and it's mostly because you could dominate them on the ground. So I think from the Falcons side, it's strictly on Julio and Ridley if they're healthy, and then also Todd Gurley as well.
I love it. And great mention of Ian Thomas. I was going to ask you about that as well. And I think a lot of it does have to come down with those, kind of under the rug matchups with Tonyan now becoming a thing and Hawkinson also on bye. You're going to have to look a little bit deeper and potentially Ian Thomas could be that guy. Great call there. Falcons are 0-4 still. Yet to get a win in 2020, and the Panthers move up to 2-2. Let's move on to another divisional matchup here. We got a lot of them this week. Next one is the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Baltimore Ravens. This one is in Baltimore. I think it's going to be a tough day for Joe Burrow. Nonetheless, the Bengals have looked pretty good. They got their first win, first one of Joe Burrow's career, 1-2-1, of course, with that tie against the Eagles last week, or 2 weeks ago, I should say. And Baltimore Ravens cruise right along here. The only blemish against the Chiefs, they are 3-1. again, Joe Mixon absolutely blows up, right? 3 total touchdowns. He finally broke out. Can we expect that moving forward? Obviously, Baltimore is a tough matchup. Moving down the list, though, A.J. Green getting peppered with targets, but they're starting to go away from him a little bit because maybe he's just not the same A.J. Green, even if he's quote-unquote healthy. Tyler Boyd looks fantastic. Can we trust T. Higgins? And on the other side here, Lamar, of course, you're starting Mark Andrews, but can you start Mark Ingram? And, of course, he does well, but there's just other mouths to feed in that Baltimore backfield, which we talk about every single week. And do you trust Hollywood Brown, who basically has to get loose on a 50-yard completion because, the efficiency just isn't there? Mark Andrews, 2 touchdowns on basically 3 receptions. So we have massive efficiency discrepancies with Baltimore. They are continually efficiency, but if they're not efficient, then you're going to get hurt. And if it wasn't for Lamar Jackson's 50-yard touchdown run, we would have had trouble there with him as well. So start your studs, of course, but I think there's a few question marks here that usually wouldn't be there with the Bengals and Ravens.
Yeah, so on the Bengals side, let's focus on their offensive first. It's a game flow thing. We talk about this a lot. We have seen some good pass volume against the Baltimore Ravens because of the fact that they're up big in most of their games. Even the game against when they were trailing against the Kansas City Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes still had to throw a lot. So this is a good volume projection for Joe Burrow. He might not be the most efficient day, but he's going to rack up yardage in this one, which I think is good news for the pass catchers in this game. So I think Joe Burrow himself is not looking at a monster game from a fantasy standpoint. I think he's not on the QB1 radar himself, but I think he can support some pass catchers because they are expected to lose big in this one. So like we talked about, game flow matters. So the guys you want to target, let's talk about Joe Mixon. That big week happened. That's fantastic. Problem is, that came in a win. No one's expecting them to win this game. Joe Mixon's not going to be able to do it on the ground because the Ravens are going to control this game. You're expecting them to win this football game, so you're expecting Joe Mixon not to get as many carries in this one. So he's going to have to do it through the air. And that's possible. I mean, we've seen multiple times now. Last week, this is a good example. Joe Mixon got a lot more routes than Gio. He played a lot in that game. So Joe Mixon, if he's getting that garbage time, if he's playing that pass game role, then that's fantastic news. But if it's Gio, we're in a lot of trouble for this one. So it could be a huge disappointment from the Joe Mixon side, especially if they don't keep up early. Now, for me, Tyler Boyd is a must start. We're going to see, I think it's, even though he plays Marlon Humphrey on the inside, like I just touched on, it's going to be fourth quarter, a lot of volume. I think you're rolling with Tyler Boyd. I think he's going to have a nice solid day because Joe Burrow's good enough to support some pass catchers in this one. Now, when you talk about T. Higgins versus A.J. Green, I think last week was the first sign, the crack in the seal, that you're going to see T. Higgins start to emerge because they ran the same amount of routes and he had more targets, a lot more targets than A.J. Green. You've touched on this guy a lot. Joe Burrow said he wanted T. Higgins in the draft. So this is a key moment for him. I think these guys are the future of this franchise. I think T. Higgins is a play this week as well because of that game flow we just talked about. And the last guy is, I'm sitting A.J. Green. I'm not worried about him, but Drew Sample. So Sample did run a decent amount of routes last week. If you look at just the guys that were startable, I mean, of course there's a bunch of one-offs, but if you look at guys that were just startable last week, Sample actually had a top 12 week. He got like over 6 points, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the tight end position versus the Jags. So this could be another one of those games where we see a lot of garbage time. Sample gets you a couple points, but I'm really focused on Tyler Boyd and Higgins on the Bengals side. And for the Ravens, this is a good point, man. I think Mark Ingram is probably the most frustrating guy. We don't need to talk about Lamar or Mark Andrews. You're starting them. Now, Mark Ingram, this is a top 5 run game matchup. This is where you got to get it done. But the problem is it going to be a very similar situation to was with the Washington Redskins, where if he needs to score. Like, is he going to score in the first half or the first 2.5 quarters when the game is relatively close for him to get you fantasy production? These are the games, if you drafted Mark Ingram, you have to play him. It's a good matchup versus Cincinnati. We've seen plenty of guys beat up on Cincinnati on the ground. You're starting Mark Ingram, and you're just hoping that he can get it done early enough to where the fourth quarter comes in, it's Gus Edwards show. And finally, Marquise Hollywood Brown. Start Marquise Hollywood Brown. This is the matchup that you want him in because right now we've seen multiple guys with a similar skill set in the sense that Odell Beckham, DJ Chark, fast speed guys on the outside beat this team for a decent production. So I think that you're going to see Marquise Hollywood Brown finally have another strong week. He did pretty well last week. He just hasn't scored touchdowns yet. You're not really expecting that guy from his stature. So I'm kind of rolling with all the main 4 guys. I'm rolling with Mark Andrews, Mark Ingram, Lamar Jackson, and also Marquise Hollywood Brown on the Ravens side.
Fantastic. Let's move on to the Jacksonville Jaguars and Houston Texans, another divisional matchup. Most of the matchups here in the earlier slate are divisional plays. This one here with Jacksonville and Houston. Jacksonville 1-3, Houston 0-4 still. Both these teams have a ton of question marks. Bill O'Brien gets fired as the OC, as the head coach, as the GM. We'll see what happens with Romeo Crennel coming in as the oldest coach in the NFL, 73 years old. And, with Deshaun Watson, hopefully they set him free a little bit more. We'll see what happens. But he's got beat-up receivers. We know that. A rough offensive line and a tough.
Can you still hear me? Are you all right? You just cut out. Sky, just get out again.
Clearing up for Leonard Fournette. So I think he's going to be just fine here. How do you feel about Jacksonville and Houston?
Perfect timing. You cut out for a second, but I'm glad you came back right when you wanted to talk to me. Jacksonville versus the Texans. This is actually one of the two lower dropback teams on a defensive basis. What I mean by that is these two teams don't see a lot of dropbacks on the defensive side of the ball. So this could be a lower passing volume game. Now, the one thing I will say on the Jags side, when you look at their injuries, they got really banged up last week. C.J. Henderson, D.J. Hayden, Miles Jack all left the game early. That's huge news for Deshaun Watson and this passing attack if you're looking at them from a passing game perspective, because the strength of the Jaguars' defense so far has been their boundary corners. So now if you can beat them in the slot and you can beat them out wide if there's no Henderson or Hayden, that's great news for Deshaun Watson, even in a game that projects to be a much lower dropback game from a passing game perspective. So let's just focus on the Jags first. I think the biggest thing for me is Gardner Minshew. He is streamable versus Houston, but at the same time, we saw Kirk Cousins, 260 yards, 1 touchdown on 22 attempts. Like, it was a very efficient game from Kirk Cousins, but it wasn't a great fantasy day. But I could see Gardner Minshew kind of getting you a little bit more volume in this game. The Jags do throw a lot more than Minnesota does on the season, so we haven't seen it yet from Houston to consistently stop teams at all. Both Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson had solid games last week, so I really do like the pass catchers in this one, especially DJ Chark. I think he's one of my favorite starts of the week. I think we haven't seen anything from the Houston secondary that's going to shut down a guy like DJ Chark. Now, on the ground game, James Robinson, this is once again one of the top run game matchups. James Robinson has been fantastic. We just see Houston getting gashed on the ground, so I really like James Robinson, and I really like DJ Chark. Now, a name to monitor in deeper leagues, I guess if you want, if you need another tight end streamer, Tyler Eifert got hurt in this last game, so it's interesting. Maybe James O'Shaughnessy kind of monopolizes those targets, because we have seen guys and teams beat the Houston Texans with their tight end. So not a big-time name, but you got to just look from a pure matchup and opportunity perspective. James O'Shaughnessy could be a factor in this one. Now, on the Texans side, like I just touched on with Deshaun Watson, I do like Deshaun Watson in this game. I think the one thing you're going to notice with Bill O'Brien, he ran the ball so much. And I think that you're right. I think they're finally going to turn him loose and kind of give him more flexibility to throw more now to kind of run this offense. So I would love to monitor the Henderson and Hayden injuries this week, because that's a big, big boost for a guy like Will Fuller and Brandon Cooks on the outside. I do like, as a standalone play, Randall Cobb. We just saw Tyler Boyd go for 790 versus this team in the past, so I do like Randall Cobb. Has kind of shown he could play a little bit still with the Texans, so I do like Randall Cobb as a wide receiver 3 this week. Now, at the tight end position, so another injury, Jordan Akins got hurt. So Jordan Akins and Darren Fells have been splitting time, and I just talked about this with Drew Sample. Drew Sample had a decent 6-point game in half-point PPR versus the Jags. Drew Sample did. So, Darren Fells, if he's the only tight end on the field, keep an eye out that, because this is a great matchup. If Jordan Akins is out, Darren Fells could be another sleeper, maybe a DFS play this week. And then David Johnson. I think I'm a little worried about David Johnson, because he's not a workhorse at all. Once Duke Johnson returned, they were like, 60-40 split and touches. So I do like David Johnson's matchup. He's a solid start. We just saw Joe Mixon go off, and Joe Mixon got his get-right game versus this Jags defense. Mm-hmm. So I think that if the Texans can really play well, establish the game early, and allow them to run the football with David Johnson a little bit more later in the game, I do like David Johnson in this matchup. So I'm pretty high on all these fantasy players this week for this matchup, but My thing is, I really want to see these injuries come to fruition. If Henderson and Hayden are out, I really like the pass volume projection for both teams.
Love it. Let's just hope people can stay healthy, man. Jeez.
Mm-hmm.
These offenses can really do a lot of work, I think, if they're able to stay healthy. But that's really just been the cheat code to the NFL season and fantasy rosters. Basically, has been if you're healthy, you're doing well. All right, let's move on to the Las Vegas Raiders and Kansas City Chiefs. This one is in Arrowhead Stadium. They are 4-0 still. You start your studs on the Chiefs pretty easy there. On the other side with Oakland, of course, Las Vegas. The Raiders are 2-2. Looked good at times. Looked like the Raiders at times here. I had mentioned earlier in the week that I'm just not excited about anybody on this team starting them. Darren Waller is kind of an automatic start because he's a tight end and you need tight ends. But he's getting 4 targets. He's getting 15 targets. Not really sure how that's going to happen. And then on the other side we have or in the backfield, I should say, you have Josh Jacobs, who had an incredible week 1 with 3 touchdowns, but he's been pretty lackluster the last 2 weeks. So what can we expect from him on that side as well? I mean, I think this is going to be an ugly game here for the Raiders in general, but for fantasy purposes, is there light at the end of the tunnel here?
Yeah, so listen, this is another one we just talked about. The Raiders are a +12 on the road, so you're looking at game flow. I think Darren Waller's the smash of the week. I think last year he had over 100 yards in this one, this game versus the Kansas City Chiefs when they were on the road. I do like Darren Waller to be like just get him in your DFS lineups this week. He's going to be fantastic. Game flow is going to dictate a lot of throws to him. And outside of him and Josh Jacobs, now with Josh Jacobs, is the game get out of hand? Because are they going to be able to run the ball 15 to 20 times with Josh Jacobs if they're down 2 scores quick? So I think John Gruden and them are going to be able to run the football early in this matchup. Now, I got to keep in mind, they're very banged up on the line, the Raiders, so that's kind of been the part of slowing down Josh Jacobs. Is that line is starting to get hurt. Trent Brown, Richie Incognito, those guys are all out. So that's kind of causing some of the problems they're having in the ground game. So Josh Jacobs is still a start. And if they're able to establish the ground game early, he should have a really nice day because the Chiefs aren't great against the run, especially with their big-time defensive tackle, Jones, that's been out the last couple of weeks. Derek Carr last year was horrible. He had, against the 2 games in the road, the last 2 seasons under Gruden, he has 1 touchdown, 4 interceptions versus the Chiefs on the road. It's just not – it's a disaster. If you're turning the ball over that much against the Chiefs, it's going to be a very long day. So the only 2 guys I'm sticking with are Josh Jacobs and Darren Waller. And as for the Chiefs, I'm not getting cute. I think it's Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I think it's Mahomes, Hill, and Kelsey. I think the Raiders' defense has been good enough that they're not going to just let Sammy Watkins and Demarcus Robinson and Mecole Hardman go off. But, I mean, you're playing almost Russian roulette with those guys. You don't know who's going to go off each week. So I'm not going to get cute. I think I'm saying Mahomes, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Hill, and Kelsey, and that is it on the Chiefs side.
I think great call, man. I totally agree all the way around. Let's get into the Denver Broncos and the New England Patriots. New England had a chance against those Chiefs last weekend on Monday Night Football, but just couldn't get it done. Multiple turnovers in their own red zone there from Brian Hoyer and then Jared Stidham. On the other side, man, Denver sneaks away with a W from the Jets last Thursday night with a breakaway game-clinching win run there from Melvin Gordon. Now, we don't expect Cam Newton back for this week. I think it's a long shot right now for him to play. Assuming he doesn't, it's Brian Hoyer and or Jared Stidham. Either way, I think they're hurting. This game is in New England. I think that helps them. Denver, their defense is not as terrible as I thought it was going to be, but it's also not amazing. That offensive line for New England is starting to worry me a little bit. We do have James White back, which has been helpful. On the other side, we do have Melvin Gordon, and then we'll see what's up with Phillip Lindsay and his health. But they have quarterback question marks as well with Rip in there too. So Drew Lock should be available maybe next week. So there's a lot of question marks in this game overall.
Yeah, and you know what? The problem is there's so many guys banged up. Noah Fant's out. Courtland Sutton's out. These guys, and then on the other side, Sony Michel, Cam Newton, is he going to be back and playing? We don't know yet, and it's up in the air. So I think when you're looking at this game, I think the one guy that I'm really excited to see is Damian Harris. We just saw him have a very, very good game on the ground this week against the Kansas City Chiefs. Now what is he going to do at home versus Denver? I mean, I think he could really be the player of the game in this matchup. So I'm rolling with Damian Harris because Sony Michel's on IR still, so I think he's going to get a bulk of the carries, and he looked good last week doing so. Hoyer scares me away from pretty much everybody, but I think Edelman's going to have a much better game in this matchup versus Denver versus Kansas City. Kansas City is one of the best defenses against wide receivers, but they're very good against slot wide receivers. So I think this matchup's going to be a little bit easier for Julian Edelman. I think he's a start, like a flex wide receiver 3 in PPR leagues. Then those other guys, I mean, why are you going to start them against, with Brian Hoyer? You're going to start, Bird was actually pretty good last week playing with Brian Hoyer. But at the same time, I just don't know if it's worth the risk in that matchup. But on the other side for Denver, I think it's a Patriots defense and Denver defense kind of matchup. I think, for on the other side, who's going to replace Noah Fant? It's going to be Nick Vannett. Are you going to start him? The Pats are very good at stopping the tight end. I think it's really just Melvin Gordon. And Melvin Gordon, to me, is kind of one of those plays where is he going to get the receptions? How much ground game are they going to get? It's one of the worst ground game matchups of the day. The Pats are very good at stopping the run. So I think Melvin Gordon's going to have to do it through receptions. And I don't even think he's a great play this week anyway. But at the same time, because of his production, he's the only man in town now. Tim Patrick actually looked very good last week, but you're looking at Stephon Gilmore and company in the secondary. So pretty much hands off for this game. Probably Melvin Gordon's probably your RB3/flex. And I think Damian Harris is actually a nice low-end RB2 in this matchup.
You good to start both DSTs in this one?
Patriots. Denver, I think you can find better streamers.
Okay, even if it's Brian Hoyer or Stidham?
The Pats at home. I think the thing is when the Patriots are home, they're going to be able to establish the run game. I think that's the biggest key here. Last week, they were playing from behind, playing the Kansas City Chiefs. Now they're playing a third-string quarterback themselves. I think the Patriots can impose their will on defense and the ground game, which is going to change the perspective of the game overall. Last week you're forcing Jarrett Stidham and Brian Hoyer to throw a lot. I don't think that's the case this week.
I agree. They had Burkhead do real well last week. You mentioned Sonny Michel on IR, so they have Damian Harris coming in, and we have James White back as well. All right, before we get into the Cardinals and Jets matchup in New Jersey, let's take a quick commercial break. I want to give a shout-out to my man, Bobby Lamarco, a.k.a. Fantasy Football X Factor. Bobby, please let and remind the TCK Potters know where they can find your content.
Yeah, guys, you can follow me at Fantasy Football X Factor on Instagram, at FFX Factor on Twitter. You can also find my articles on football.rasball.com. I do my shadow coverage report. And I also do my opportunities analysis at expandtheboxscore.com.
Excellent. Fantastic. I appreciate that and always appreciate having you on. Of course, if you're new to the podcast or you haven't yet given us a follow, please follow the TCK Pod, a.k.a. Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast on Instagram at fantasyfootball_TCK Pod. Send your start-sit questions there, your trade questions there as well. And you can also find us on Twitter at TCK_pod. And all of our weekly rankings and articles are available at tckpod.com. And please leave a rate and review right here on the podcast wherever you're listening. All right, man, we got a couple more games left before we get into our pick'em. Let's get into the Cardinals at the Jets. Cardinals are 2-2. Should be 4-0 in the games that they've played. They've played very well so far, but they've had some bozo last minute plays. And Kyler Murray, man, just 130 passing yards is not going to get it done. But the Jets 0-4. Somehow their head coach still has a job, but that's a conversation for another week, I guess. On the Cardinals side, you start Kyler, you start Nuke. Big question mark with Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds. I want to hear your thoughts on that. On the other side with the Jets, is anybody startable outside of Jamison Crowder potentially?
Yeah, so I think with the Cardinals, when you're looking at them, obviously you're going to start Kyler Murray in this matchup. But just remember something, like this game is not going to look pretty. I mean, the Cardinals are probably one of the favorite. The streamer defense of the week is probably the Cardinals versus the Jets. Sam Darnold's looking out, but listen, Joe Flacco is a veteran. I mean, he's a savvy vet. I know he's not the biggest time, the sexiest play, but at the same time, Joe Flacco is going to be able to support some pass catchers in this game. He's not a complete dud as a quarterback in the NFL. So I will say that, but I love the Cardinals DST in this game. Kyler Murray is obviously a must-start, but just remember that the Jets' defense has been very interesting because they've been getting dominated so early in games that they don't put up a fight, and then these passing games don't throw that much. So I think Kyler Murray is a must-start. But when you're looking at the other weapons in this game, I think it's Nuke Hopkins, and then a number 2 might be able to get you something. So maybe Christian Kirk can finally have that breakout game. The Jets secondary has been beatable. Like I think the most relatable player is John Brown. So you saw Diggs and Brown have very good games against the secondary. It could be very similar to Hopkins and maybe Christian Kirk. We saw Christian Kirk kind of get it going a little bit from a fantasy perspective in week 4, so maybe he can build off that performance, especially against a Jets team that just doesn't seem like they have any fight in them anymore at this point. Now, for Kenyon Drake, this is a very bad matchup for the run game. I mean, the Jets, the one thing they do well is stop the run. They have a very good defensive line. They've been able to stop run games pretty consistently. So this doesn't seem like the get-right spot for Kenyon Drake. So I'm a little worried about Drake in the sense that, is Chase Edmonds? What if Chase Edmonds start looking better? But I think they're committed to Drake long-term. I think after this game, the buy low window. I mean, the buy low window is now anyway. I think I'm definitely buying Kenyon Drake season long, but this matchup, really, he's going to have to do it through the air, and he's not getting targets. That's the problem with Kenyon Drake. He's not getting targets, and then Chase Edmonds goes in the game, and he gets all the targets. So it's very odd that Drake's not being used, and then Edmonds is. So that is a little bit of a red flag. So Cliff Kingsbury has to do a better job getting, other than Hopkins, we need to see other guys getting involved in this pass game to really, balance out the fantasy perspective for everybody. Now, for the Jets, like I just touched on, Sam Darnold might be out. Now, Joe Flacco, listen, I'm not saying Joe Flacco's the start of the week or anything, but the one thing I will tell you is he's going to be able to support somebody. So Jamison Crowder has the best matchup. So we see slot receivers are much better versus the Cardinals than facing Patrick Peterson and Byron Murphy on the outside. Drake Patrick's also playing at a very, very high level for this secondary. So I think from my perspective, Crowder's still on the fantasy radar. I think from the running back perspective, just don't do it. Like, there's no point in doing it. Just be smart. You guys are TCK Potters. I guarantee you're not going to play a Jets running back, but I digress. And then Chris Herndon, I'm disappointed. I loved Chris Herndon early on. I think, the matchups have not been good for him so far this season. Technically, this is a decent matchup for him, but he's not running the routes. I don't know why, but they feel like they're going to give – I think the guy's name's Smith, the guy that had the most routes last week.
Jeff Smith.
Yeah, Smith, and then – Chris Hogan's out there running more.
Braxton
Berrios than Chris Herndon. For some reason, I thought that he was going to want to use a pass-catching tight end. Has not been the case. He's been far behind wide receivers in routes, which is not the way to get fantasy production. So it is what it is. It's unfortunate. I think from the Jet side, it's just Jamison Crowder.
Got it. Let's move on to the Battle of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia at Pittsburgh. Man, huge win for the Eagles. Terrible loss for the 49ers. We'll just leave it at that. But the Eagles finally get their first win after an 0-2-1 start. They're 1-2-1 right now. Carson Wentz getting it done enough with no help. Miles Sanders definitely stunted by the 49ers, but he should be just fine. But look out for the Pittsburgh defense. Ertz, 9 yards last week. Not Trey Burton, excuse me. Richard Rodgers, sorry, a blast from the past there name-wise, filling in for Dallas Goedert, had a decent game. I think he's kind of a sneak attack play as they double cover Ertz over the middle there. Greg Ward, of course, is kind of a spot start if you need there. And then on the other side for Pittsburgh, look, they had the week off last week because of the COVID situation with Tennessee. They're all fresh. I think that's huge. Injury-wise, they were not planning on a bye week. They took the bye week because of the COVID issue. But look, that was big for Big Ben just because he's older and he needs that. It might be rough later in the season when they don't get another bye. But James Conner had a chance to rest. Juju as well. Deontay Johnson had a concussion going into that bye week, so he should be totally fine as well. And then, of course, that defense gets a minute to freshen up as well there. So this one I think is going to be not a shootout. I think it's just going to be a kind of a hard, old-school football game here in Pittsburgh. But how do you feel about these guys fantasy-wise with not many weapons on the Philadelphia side? Wentz is doing the best he can, but if we can get everybody healthy in Pittsburgh, it could be fun.
Yeah, so I think the thing with the Eagles, they're +7 underdogs on the road, and you're probably looking at a similar situation that we thought with the 49ers. But the problem is the Steelers' offense is legit, and I think they're at home. They're rolling with Big Ben and company at home versus the Eagles' secondary that's decimated by injuries. But let's focus on the Eagles first. Carson Wentz, to me, is obviously not a viable QB1 this week, but every QB so far this season against the Pittsburgh Steelers has gotten 250 yards and 2 touchdowns. So for whatever that's worth, I feel like Wentz is going to get his numbers. I just don't think he's a high-end starter with all the injuries to his receiving core, but Alshon Jeffrey might be coming back this week. We're not sure about Deshaun Jackson's injury as well, but At the same time, last week you're throwing to Greg Ward and, Ertz, and you don't even have Dallas Goedert. So you can't really fault the guy. But for whatever it's worth, quarterbacks have produced against the Steelers, even with their really tough defense, for whatever that is. So the other problem is there is no offensive line. So Lane Johnson got hurt again. Both guards are out, of course. One of them got hurt earlier in the season, and their left tackle, Jason Peters, just got put on IR. So they're down 4 starters, essentially, on the offensive line this week. That is just bad news for Miles Sanders. He's going to have to get it done through the air. The only way Miles Sanders is going to be a very big fantasy play this week is if he gets you like 5 for 50 and a score through the air, because they are not going to be able to run the football against the Pittsburgh Steelers at all in this game. So I am a little worried for Miles Sanders. Still a start season long, but fade him in DFS. As for the wide receiving core, we have seen guys produce against the Steelers defense. I think for me, really, it's about speed. I love Deshaun Jackson if he's healthy, and if he plays, I think he's a great matchup against these corners. Can definitely get loose. Alshon Jeffrey, too, we don't know how much he's going to actually play in his first game back, so it's not a likely start for him, but I think that would be good news for the passing game as a whole. But at the same time, whoever's the number 1 on the week, he might be fantasy viable. So if it's Greg Ward, because of the game flow and because of the current situation, he's probably going to be a solid wide receiver 3 in this matchup because he's going to be necessity, especially on the road, big underdogs, etc. And Zach Ertz has a horrible matchup. Pittsburgh's been very good against tight ends this season, so I'm not excited to start Zach Ertz. But I think a lot of teams, you invest such a high draft capital in him. But a guy, for example, I would play over him is like Jonnu Smith. And we'll talk about him, obviously, in a little bit. But I think that, from my perspective, Zach Ertz is not a big fantasy guy this week. Don't play him in DFS. On the Pittsburgh side, Big Ben at home. Like, that's fun. Just play Big Ben at home. The Eagles' secondary is completely decimated. I mean, Darius Slay is hobbling around now. If Darius Slay is slowed down at all, there's really no one that's going to stop anybody on this defense. So I think Deontay Johnson, to me, is the one player that is a little iffy. If Darius Slay is healthy, practicing in full this week, he is very tough against their number 1 receiver. So Slay could be on Deontay Johnson, making him nothing more than just a wide receiver 3 at best in this matchup. And then I love Big Ben, but I love the matchups up the middle. What I mean by that is slot receivers and tight ends. Juju Smith-Schuster and Eric Ebron. I think Eric Ebron was one of my favorite sleepers last week before the game got canceled. I think Eric Ebron could really have a nice role in this one, especially if Deontay Johnson's taken out by Darius Slay. I think Juju's a must-start. I think Eric Ebron is actually in play as a low-end tight end 1. And here's a bold prediction. I think Eric Ebron outscores Zach Ertz in this matchup. So I think that's something I would say is a bold prediction for that. And then James Conner, he's a true workhorse. So you're not going to sit workhorses. Even in a tough matchup, Philadelphia's front is legit. That's the one area they're not completely decimated. They're just a pass funnel defense. But at the same time, James Conner can get you 4 for 40 through the air. Then he can also get you, 40, 50 yards on the ground. Those points start adding up. And if you sprinkle in a touchdown, you have a very good fantasy day. So I'm still starting James Conner.
Love it, man. That's a great breakdown, and I love the call on Eric Ebron. Could definitely happen. He's a big body. He's starting to get that more of the rapport there with Big Ben, and certainly could outperform Zach Ertz potentially if they just take him out of the game, because we know that front 7 for Pittsburgh is league best. They're the number 1 defense right now in scoring. The Colts were last week, and they now the Steelers are there. I mean, they've only played 3 games where the Colts have played 4, but nonetheless. That Steelers defense is very impressive. We'll see if the Steelers can stay undefeated and get to 4-0. Speaking of 4-0 teams, the Buffalo Bills, led by Josh Allen, of course, in the MVP race as of right now, 4-0, head into Tennessee. Tennessee, of course, off with Pittsburgh last week with the COVID situation. They seem to have this game set to play, so we'll expect it to happen. Tennessee 3-0 as well. So 3 of the remaining undefeated AFC teams going off in this one here. So Pittsburgh, of course, against Philadelphia, and then the Titans and the Bills as well. On the Bills side, look, you're firing everybody up at this point. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the backfield there. If Zach Moss is healthy, how are you going to do it? If not, obviously Singletary is automatic. And then are you comfortable with John Brown and or Cole Beasley, who's been kind of a nice spot fill if we need there? And then on the other side with Tennessee, you're starting Henry, of course, and then you like Jonnu. We'll start Jonnu, and then how's A.J. Brown doing? He's out another week, and then we start up Corey Davis. And how are you feeling about Ryan Tannehill, who has kind of put himself in that automatic start scenario, but this Buffalo defense is also pretty good as well?
Yeah, this is a quiet shootout. So both defenses are underperforming this year. In a lot of cases, especially for the Titans secondary, it's because of injuries. But for the most part, these defenses are not playing well, and these offenses are playing very well. So the Buffalo Bills are a quiet pass funnel defense. Like, they have gotten so many passing attempts against them this season. So, but I think let's focus on the Bills first from a matchup perspective. So the Zach Moss thing is huge for Devin Singletary. We have seen a lot of teams kind of beat the Titans on the ground. So we saw Robinson and Dalvin Cook over 100 yards versus this Titans run defense. And I think that Singletary can get it done on the ground, but now we're talking, instead of a full workload, 12 carries and 8 for Moss. That's going to be much harder to get it done on the ground. But I do like Devin Singletary in this game. But the problem is it going to be Moss on the goal line again? So this is the problem with the Devin Singletary situation. This might be your sell high window. Like, I think my best fantasy advice for Devin Singletary is, if Moss is practicing and you think he's coming back, this might be the time to sell him, because Moss might be the goal line back still. And I don't have the answers just yet, unfortunately, on that. But the ground game it's a plus for them. So they both could get it done a decent amount, but it's going to be 10, maybe 11 carries for Singletary instead of the full workload if Zach Moss is back. QB, we're not going to talk about Josh Allen. You're rolling with Josh Allen, but who beats the Titans? So from the passing game perspective, it's been mostly inside guys. So Noah Fant had a very good game against them. DJ Chark on the outside had a very nice game, but Keelan Cole actually had the most catches in that matchup and a touchdown. So that was an interesting nugget. And then Justin Jefferson tore the defense apart on the slot. So I think when you're looking at this matchup for who would probably be the best plays, the funny thing about the Bills, they've gone 4 wide now. They go 4 wide a bunch. They have Gabriel Davis now with Cole Beasley inside. Diggs is inside a lot. I love Stephon Diggs this week. I think you're going to continue to roll with him as long as Adoree Jackson continues to be out. There's just nobody that can stop Stephon Diggs in this matchup. Now, you brought up John Brown, and listen, John Brown has been very good this season. He's been very streaky up and down, but at the same time, the way the Titans have been getting beat this season has been in the slot. But that being said, if you look at the Titans' corners, it's Jonathan Joseph, Malcolm Butler. Those are 2 veteran-savvy corners, but they're not quick. So John Brown can get loose for a long one. So I kind of feel in John Brown a little bit. I think he's got the speed like a DJ Chark that can break up a long one. So I'm feeling pretty much John Brown and Diggs in this game. Cole Beasley is not running as much routes anymore because Gabriel Davis has now become an emerging player for this team. He actually ran more routes than Beasley last week. So Beasley's still getting the targets, but now Davis is getting the routes. So that's something to watch. So I'm just kind of fading that in general. I'm sticking with Brown and Diggs in this game. I think they both can win their matchups. On the other side for the Titans now, for me, when I watch, it's Adam Humphries. He just got diagnosed with COVID. He's not playing this week. That's big news for a guy like Jonnu Smith. So Ryan Tannehill is one of the quarterbacks. Last year, Football Outsiders does a thing called slot versus wide quarterbacks, and Ryan Tannehill targets the slot relentlessly. I mean, it's insane how much he actually throws in the middle. So you're going to look at it, and then you look at the matchup versus Buffalo. Who dominates Buffalo? Jamison Crowder, Mike Gesicki, Cooper Kupp, Darren Waller. Inside guys, tight ends, and slot receivers. So I think Jonnu Smith is one of the starts of the week in this matchup because if A.J. Brown plays great, I mean, I think you got to roll with A.J. Brown. I think this game could be a little bit high scoring, so I'm playing A.J. Brown. But if Brown is out, that means Tre'Davious White is going to be on Corey Davis. I'm not big on Corey Davis winning that matchup, so I do really like Jonnu Smith in this game. But a guy that's Khalif Raymond is a deep sleeper, and the reason why is he's going to take over the main slot receiving role for Adam Humphries. And I just touched on all the guys that beat the Bills. Now, he's a speedster, too. This guy is a deep threat. He's already got a lot of deep throws from Ryan Tannehill. But now you're going to give him the volume in routes. He could be a nice wide receiver 3 dart throw, maybe a DFS tournament play this week as well. So I really like Tannehill as well. We saw Derek Carr, of all people, throw for 300 yards against Buffalo. So I think Tannehill's still a start. Even if Corey Davis is a little bit slower, I think he's still going to be able to get it done with Jonnu Smith, Khalif Raymond, and especially if A.J. Brown plays, I think he's a must-start quarterback 1 this week.
Got to get A.J. Brown back, man. I saw a tweet today that, it's like, don't forget that A.J. Brown is the AFC version of DK Metcalf. So we need to get A.J. Brown back in the saddle. So great breakdown there. All right, man, last one, and then we will get into our pick 'em for this week here for the early slots. LA Rams, Washington football team. Rams are 3-1, And the football team is 1-3 here. The Rams, geez, I mean, should have absolutely beat up on the Giants. They didn't. They got the W, but they let them linger around a little bit too much for my comfort. Jared Goff on the road, different than Jared Goff at home, of course. Also, this game should not be a shootout, if you will, just the nature of Washington's game flow generally. Although last week when they got beat up by the Ravens, Antonio Gibson went nuts, and Terry McLaurin had 14 targets as well. And Dwayne Haskins, who I don't think is particularly good, had over 300 yards passing on that Ravens defense. He didn't throw a touchdown, but he did rush for one there. Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods had a tougher week last week, especially Woods. I talked to you pregame last Sunday about Robert Woods and getting shadowed by Bradbury and whatnot, and I did sit him in a league, and I'm thankful that I did. Do you trust him again this week? And then on the backfield here, what are we going to do? Henderson didn't do much last week. Malcolm Brown looked real good early, but didn't do much overall. And what are we going to do with Cam Akers? And then can we trust Tyler Higbee? He has huge games. He disappears. It looked like Gerald Everett had a rushing touchdown early in the game, and Higbee wasn't really much to be found there. So a lot of moving parts in this game, and I just don't think that this Washington defensive line, which has been real solid, without Chase Young, it's just not the same. So maybe Goff will be able to sit back there and cook them up.
Yeah, and like you said, road golf, but ironically he had the big game against Buffalo and then the dud at home versus the Giants, which doesn't make sense. It's 2020, right? So, this is what I talk about too. The Washington football team is very difficult to figure out because they're very good against – in the end of the box score, they're very good against quarterbacks because they get dominated early in so many games. So they're losing big, and quarterbacks aren't throwing much. There has been very low pass volume versus the Washington football team, so it's very hard to truly judge that defense. And then when you look at the two injuries, like you said, Chase Young, but they also lost a defensive tackle. So that big-time strength really is no longer a strength for the Washington football team because they're down two of their key starters up front. So now, Cam Akers should be back this week, so that really just makes everything convoluted again. Is it going to be Cam Akers? Is it going to be Malcolm Brown? Did Henderson do enough to make sure he has a role? That just seems like a headache to me, but my gut tells me it's Akers is going to be the guy that comes in. But Malcolm Brown was the pass game back. Malcolm Brown ran the routes last week. Malcolm Brown is still going to be the main guy. He's the trusted veteran in pass pro, so that's just something to monitor overall, but at the same time, it's very convoluted with those guys. I'm not starting Goff this week. I don't think it's even worth it. I think the Rams control this football game. They play well enough on the road to just handle their business. I think Goff is going to have a nice, easy, smooth game, like 250 and 2, hit on cruise control and win that football game. So he's probably a high-end QB2 at best because of that. Now, for the wide receivers, it is a tougher matchup. But I do really like Woods over Kupp in this game. I think Woods, we have seen outside receivers do very well against the Washington football team. So I think I'm going to lean Woods over Kupp in this game, especially because of that matchup. But when you look at the tight ends, it's a great matchup for the tight ends. It should be very good for Tyler Higbee. Tyler Higbee should be able to get in the end zone in this one. I think when your matchup's this good, you probably should play him. But the problem is, he ran the fifth. He split worked with Gerald Everett last week. So the first time we've really seen Everett back healthy, playing a full allotment of snaps, and unfortunately they split routes. And that's bad news for fantasy. But at the same time, Higbee is a red zone threat. So he's always good for a touchdown. So when you see a plus matchup, I think you should be able to roll with Tyler Higbee because he's probably good for a score in this game because the Washington football team really isn't stopping anybody. They haven't been proven. If you want to beat them, you can beat them with their – but Mark Andrews had a relatively slow game last week versus this team, so I'm not overly excited, I guess. But at the same time, Higbee probably in my lineups if I have him. And then I would say Woods and Kupp as well are both going to be fine plays. But like I touched on, this is a low pass volume matchup. You're not expecting Goff to draw back and throw 40 times. You're expecting them to handle their own, especially with the injuries up front. I think they can run the football in this game. Now for the other side, Washington football team, I think we were late on Antonio Gibson. Last week I was like, he's got one more tough matchup, and then you go buy him. He's going to be awesome, and then he blows up, and you're not going to be able to get him. So if you waited, sorry. But Antonio Gibson could have another big day against the Rams. We saw the Giants actually get something going, which is impossible. The Giants' running game has been so bad this season, but they're able to get something on the ground going against the Rams last week. So I do like Antonio Gibson. We saw Singletary and Sanders and Zeke have nice run games against this team. So I think really Antonio Gibson to me is the star amongst the Washington football team players. Now, when you look at the matchup itself, you would think Jalen Ramsey's going to shadow Terry McLaurin, and it probably is going to happen. But at the same time, I don't care anymore. Game flow is critical for McLaurin. We've seen all season long these matchups are tough. The Ravens is a tough matchup, and he still plays very well because they're down 2-3 touchdowns. The Cardinals are one of the best defenses against wide receivers, and sure enough, McLaurin scores 60 yards and a touchdown in the fourth quarter. So I think until the Redskins start showing they can play some defense, you're always going to play Terry McLaurin. And I think I got to play some sad music and wave the white flag on Logan Thomas. You know, it was a fun 1 week. I had a ball. Week 1 was great. I threw a party. But at the same time, I think he's off the fantasy radar. We just started seeing some different usage last week. They have a young wide receiver named Isaiah Wright, big-bodied player who actually started getting a lot of routes, and someone to monitor because he's a good complement to Terry McLaurin's more of a shifty speed guy versus a route runner technician versus that big body guy with the right. So I think that's something to monitor. And also Gibson started running a lot more routes. So Gibson, J.D. McKissick. So I think Logan Thomas might be done. So I think really in this matchup it's just Gibson and McLaurin on the Washington football team. For the Rams, I think you're rolling with Woods and Kupp and Tyler Higbee, and then you're playing. I can't tell you which running back it's going to be, but I would lean Cam Akers in this game.
Something interesting to mention about the Rams here. So in week 5, they play obviously at Washington, who is the worst matchup against wide receivers in fantasy football currently. Then next week, they're at San Francisco, who is the second worst matchup, meaning the best, or meaning the toughest, I should say that. So Washington is the toughest currently. San Francisco is the second toughest. Then they have Chicago at home, who is the third toughest matchup. So 3 weeks in a row for the Rams receivers against the 3 toughest matchups, Washington, San Francisco, Chicago. Then they get Miami, who's 8th best. That's great. Then they have a bye week in week 9. Then they get Seattle, who everyone's been ripping up, except for the Dolphins, of course, in week 10. After that, though, they get Tampa Bay, San Francisco again, and then Arizona, 22nd, 31st, and 28th in wide receiver matchup before the playoffs. It gets a little easier. So, look, I love Cooper Kupp. I love Robert Woods, especially in PPR leagues. But if you can potentially move on these guys now, it might be a good move before it potentially is too late and they struggle a little bit. So I'm not saying, sell them for nothing. But if they're in a package or you want to make a move and bring somebody else in, right now would be the time to maybe get off the Rams potentially, just a trade heads up on that. All right, man, we got a couple minutes left, but we can't go without getting your weekly pick'ems in. So let's go down the list here and let's get your pick'ems dialed in, man. We'll start, of course, just with the early slot and see who you've got. So we'll start with Carolina and Atlanta. Again, we've gone through all the content, so why don't you just give me a one-word answer: Carolina Panthers at Atlanta Falcons. Oh, are you there? I think we lost him, unfortunately. Let's see here, just a minute. All right. Unfortunately, I just got a message. Bobby had to drop off. He had some technical difficulties, as you can hear there at the end of the episode. We're going to cut it here, folks. Sometimes, it just doesn't work out, and we everyone's been working a lot of technical difficulties the last 8 months, so no big deal, man. Bobby's doing his best, and he just had a technical difficulty, so we'll catch him next week. Make sure you go check out the Fantasy Football X Factor on Instagram and Twitter. You can catch the TCK Pod and the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast on Instagram at fantasyfootball_TCK Pod and on Twitter at TCK_pod. Check out our website with the rankings and articles, tckpod.com. And, of course, you can leave a rate and review right now where you're listening to your podcast. It means a lot, helps us get some street cred, so we would love to get you back in the place here and get you back involved with the Candlestick Kids Fantasy Football Podcast. And we may have been able to bring Bobby in just at the very end here. Bobby, you back with us?
Yes, sir. What's going on? Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries, man. It is the season. We're having, unfortunately, a lot of technical difficulties. I was just signing off, but you're back. So let's get in your Okay, unfortunately, folks.
Yeah, I mean, I keep cutting in and out. Sorry, man. I don't know what's going on. I
No
apologize.
worries. Let's try one more time. Carolina at Atlanta.
Atlanta,
Got it. Moving down the list here. Cincinnati at Baltimore.
Baltimore,
Jacksonville at Houston.
Houston,
Las Vegas at Kansas City.
Kansas City,
Denver at New England.
New England,
Arizona at New York Jets.
Arizona,
Philadelphia at Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh,
Buffalo at Tennessee.
Buffalo,
I like it. LA Rams at Washington.
Rams.
All right, man. Thank you very much. I was just signing off and sending all the TTK Potters to go see you. But since you're here one more time, let us know where we can find your content.
Yeah, man. You can follow me at Fantasy Football X Factor on Instagram and at FFX Factor on Twitter. You can also find articles on Razzball.com. I write about shadow coverage and also Expand the Box Score, where I talk about the opportunity analysis.
Excellent. Fantastic. Look at Fantasy Football X Factor. Tomorrow we bring back Dewey's Nuts for the later half, as well as the Thursday night football game, Sunday late slot, and Sunday night football game, as well as Monday night football. And on Friday, of course, Chris Benavides of the Commish Fantasy Football Podcast to break down and preview the TCK Pod Listener League for Week 4 and Week 5. For Bobby Lamarco, I'm Scott Guasco, and we are out of here.